prosperity. What happens in the coming months may prove decisive, and we are focused on providing Ukraine with the military capabilities it needs to defend its people and its territory. We are doing this in close cooperation with our allies and partners. First, we have focused on a layered, integrated approach to air defense to counter Russia's devastating attacks on Ukraine's population centers and civilian infrastructure. The Patriot capability from the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands will give Ukraine advanced long-range capability. These are complemented by the medium and short-range air defense capabilities, such as NASAMS and Avenger, that we have provided. Second, to enhance Ukraine's ability to maneuver, the United States will provide Abrams main battle tanks, the best tanks in the world. The United Kingdom has also committed Challenger tanks, and other European states will provide Leopard tanks. These main battle tanks are complemented by other vital armor capabilities, such as Bradleys and Strykers from the United States, Swedish CV-90s, French AMX-10s, and German Martyrs. Third, we have expanded U.S.-led collective training to enable the Ukrainians to integrate fires and maneuver. Our training will complement the specialized training conducted by the United States, the European Union, and our allies. And finally, we continue to work with allies and partners to deliver a steady flow of artillery rounds and other ammunition so Ukraine can sustain its fight. Russia has discovered that the United States and our allies and partners are serious about supporting Ukraine for the long haul. Our assistance to Ukraine is possible thanks to bipartisan support from Congress. The Department of Defense appreciates the most recent Additional Supplemental Appropriations Act, which provided presidential drawdown authority, funding for the military services to replace items sent to Ukraine, and funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI. Presidential drawdown allows us to get Ukraine critical capabilities quickly. USAI allows us to contract with industry for new and innovative solutions while building Ukraine's longer-term defense. We are also ramping up defense industrial-based production of critical munitions and equipment, doubling or, in some cases, tripling capacity. Even as we focus on getting Ukraine what it needs, we have always prioritized accountability, and Ukraine has too. We have adapted our accountability practices for the combat environment to address the risk of illicit diversion using mechanisms that go above and beyond our standard practices. The U.S. government has not seen credible evidence of any diversion of U.S.-provided weapons outside of Ukraine. Instead, we see Ukraine's frontline units effectively employing security assistance every day on the battlefield. Nearly a year ago, Russia launched its brutal invasion to destroy Ukraine as a free and sovereign nation, threatening European security and transatlantic unity. Today, NATO is stronger, Europe is investing in its own security at record rates, and the incredible people and armed forces of Ukraine remain unbowed and unbroken. This war has demonstrated that aggression is not worth the price paid by the aggressor. That is a lesson that should reverberate around the world, including among autocratic leaders everywhere. As Secretary Austin has said, free people always refuse to replace an open order of rules and rights with one dictated by force and fear. We are determined to support Ukraine's fight against tyranny and oppression, and in doing so, to defend the American interests and values that are so clearly at stake. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you all for your testimony. We'll start a round of 5-minute questions, and let me make some prefatory remarks before I go to my questions here. I'm all in and have been since 2014 when I waved my saber and said we should be far more responsive to the invasion of Crimea because it was the warning sign. And the world, including the United States, was relatively mute in its response to the invasion annexation of Crimea. And so then Putin got the message that you can march on. And that's part of what's at stake now, that he can march on. Now, there are those I know who have an insular view and others who have a legitimate question. And as someone who, back at home in New Jersey, when I'm asked by my constituents, why are we spending so much money on Ukraine? I make the point to them that, in fact, what is at stake is not only the Ukrainians' freedom, which in and of itself is important, but also the proposition that you cannot by force take another country's territory. Because if that can become the rule of the day, there are many despots and authoritarians who will seek to do that. China in Taiwan, North Korea possibly against South Korea, the list is endless. But having said that, I would commend to you, Madam Secretary, to speak to the Secretary and to the administration, that I think it's important that we articulate what is our definition of victory and what is the blueprint for victory in order to continue to have the bipartisan support of Congress for the resources that will be necessary to achieve that victory. I think that's critically important. Not saying that we don't have one, but it hasn't been well articulated if there is one. And if there isn't a full vision of what that blueprint is, we should be thinking about what it is and how we execute on it. With that, and we also, I'm a strong supporter, I have voted for everything for the Ukrainians and passed legislation going back to 2014. But we also have to tell our friends in Ukraine, you can't sell white phosphorus to the Azerbaijanis that kill Armenians. There are responsibilities as well, not just the opportunity to receive resources. My first question is about sanctions, and it is particularly about China. As you well know, President Putin met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in February of 22, where they touted their no-limits partnership, just weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since that time, I understand there's been evidence that Chinese companies, including working through Hong Kong, have been exporting dual-use technologies, including semiconductor chips, which are critically important to fill in, particularly on missile guidance systems, that Russia needs to continue its onslaught of Ukraine. It seems to me that we should not forsake the potential of sanctions against China if it is providing critical assistance. And it shouldn't be able to hide behind some companies. Have we raised these concerns at the highest levels of the Chinese government? Is this support from China to Russia not a direct violation of U.S. sanctions?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for your strong personal support for Ukraine and your perfect articulation of what's at stake here, which the President agrees with, as he said yesterday. With regard to China, yes, from well before this latest invasion began, in November and December even of 21, we began an intense conversation with China at every level, which the President himself has led, and all of our senior leaders have been involved in, with regard to their relationship with Russia and about their own interests, in our view, in upholding the UN Charter and not allowing Putin-style rules of the road to dominate. And we've made clear that we will bring to their attention when we see sanctions violations by their companies. And we've been very clear with regard to the impact on our relationship and their standing in the world.
I just don't think that we have followed up those conversations with robust sanctions against companies that are providing dual-use technology that is allowing the Russians to continue to have access to missile capabilities that we should not let them have. It seems to me that, we need to, in addition to all the money that we are providing, all the defense equipment we're providing, we need to cut the head of the snake off in every way we can. And that means sanctioning it directly and its inner core, which I give the administration credit for, but it also means sanctioning those vigorously who are assisting Russia in this unjust and unholy war. And so I hope we will be far more robust in that regard. I don't care that it's China. I don't care who it is. At the end of the day, they cannot act with impunity and face no consequence.
We agree with that, Chairman, and we have a new set of sanctions out today, which I think you will see some of the things that you've been calling for.
I look forward to that.
Particularly with regard to.
I don't know if you're familiar directly with what I mentioned in my opening statement about the Magnitsky letter on Vladimir Kara-Murza. It is past the time statutorily to get an answer. I see no reason why, in fact, we cannot, in essence, have sanctions against someone who's one of Russia's biggest critics, Putin's biggest critics, not Russia's biggest critics, Putin's biggest critics, and is jailed as a result of it. We should make it clear through Magnitsky sanctions. Senator Cardin has been the author of that law. This is an example of what it was meant to use. And so could you get us an answer, please?
We're not only going to get you an answer, we're going to get you Magnitsky sanctions in very short order.
Bravo, bravo, bravo. All right, now, lastly, what are we doing as it relates to the need for, some of us went to The Hague earlier last year to press the case on sanctions and prosecutions against those who are committing war crimes. There must be accountability, and accountability without prosecutions is not accountability. Are we focused on that as well?
We are, Chairman. We have a G7 working group of lawyers as well as the group of G7 political directors that I'm involved in looking at various models of accountability. There are 3 or 4 under consideration. I think we'll have more to say about that as we approach the anniversary in terms of the actual setting up of judicial proceedings. But in the meantime, and Aaron can speak to this in more detail, we are involved in supporting all kinds of accountability mechanisms on the ground in Ukraine, everything from collecting evidence to supporting the cataloging of atrocities, etc. And we're working with the Ukrainians on some interim measures of registries of attack, etc., that could be used for future accountability. I don't know if Erin has anything she wants to add there.
Thank you, Senator. We are working very closely on the ground through our human rights and access to justice centers that have a network throughout Ukraine, over 22 locations, to gather and document the evidence for such time to be able to, as you said, prosecute and hold accountable those actions inside Ukraine. So we aren't waiting for the determination for that process to be set up, but preparing all we can so that when it is in place, swift and appropriate due process can be made and the evidence is available.
The earlier that possible prosecutions are prosecuted and successfully done will send a chilling effect to those who think they can act with impunity. Senator Rickey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nuland, what you said there are going to be new sanctions out today. Who are those going to be against? Who are the targets of those sanctions?
Ranking Member-ish, there are more than 40 sanctions coming out. They may actually have been published at about 10:30. The vast majority of them are against Prigozhin and the Wagner Group in Africa. There are also sanctions against Putin's cronies, against those who provide material support to Russia's military-industrial complex. And then there is one in particular that addresses the chairman's question with regard to China.
Yeah, the chairman and I have both been anxious to see what's happening with China, because China seems to be acting with impunity, and that we really need to ratchet up our sanctions in that regard. They may be big, but they're not too big to fail in that regard, and we really need to ratchet the sanctions up there. Also, Secretary Nuland, first of all, I think most of us here were glad to see that finally the administration yesterday agreed to provide Abrams tanks, and we've been calling for this for some time. But we've been repeatedly told over the months that sending tanks to Ukraine was not possible or desirable or would somehow be escalatory. And all of a sudden it changed yesterday. How did that, this is embarrassing. How did that change? What happened?
Well, I'm going to let Assistant Secretary Wallner talk about the internal discussion inside the Pentagon. What I will say to you, Ranking Member, is that Abrams, as you know, are very sophisticated tanks and they require significant training. So even as we approved them yesterday, it's going to take some time to get them to the battlefield. So this is not something that's going to appear in time for the spring offensive. What is most needed,
which underscores what I said. You know, we've been asking for this for 6 months. Had you started 6 months ago, they'd be all ready for the spring offensive. So what happened here? Who's to blame for this?
You know, I think at every stage of this, we have looked at what the Ukrainians have needed, what they've been requesting. There was a period in the fall where they were capturing a huge number of Russian tanks on the battlefield, which they were able to use successfully in the Kherson and Kharkiv offensive, but now they need more, and so we are responding.
Well, it didn't answer the question, but I guess we're not going to get an answer to that question. But I got to tell you, it's all through this thing we've been pressing the administration to do things, and usually they do the right thing, but it takes forever to get there. And as a result of that, there's a great loss on the battlefield and lives lost in the meantime. So I want to underscore that the administration truly needs to act more rapidly. That brings us, Secretary Walter, to the Stryker combat vehicles. As we all know, there's different versions of the Stryker vehicles, and one of the things that the Ukraine's been asking for is the Strykers that are equipped with the cannons that are comparable to those found on tanks. But the administration's declining to give them those. They're giving them something with only machine guns and no heavy weapons, and they're really not much more than an armored taxicab. What's going on there? Can we expect a reversal of that, hopefully, in the near future?
Senator, I do not have information on